Hi, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm Catherine Paquette, a freshwater specialist with WWF Canada. And as was mentioned, I'll be presenting our watershed reports too. So I do want to begin with a land acknowledgement. I think we had a really great one and a great sort of introduction to living land acknowledgements earlier in the day. But I do want to acknowledge that while we're meeting virtually, and I think we're coming from lots of different traditional territories, I myself am coming to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe, and coming to you from just a few hundred meters from the beautiful Kitchissippi, or also known as the Ottawa River. So a little bit about WWF Canada to start off with. We're a national organization. We've been working in Canada for more than half a century. We are part of a global network, so you might have heard of WWF International or WWF from different countries, but I work for WWF Canada. And we are committed to confronting and working on the dual crises of biodiversity loss and climate change, which have already been mentioned here today. And these crises have just been made a lot more difficult to address with the current pandemic. So today I'll be talking about our watershed reports. And these we initially launched in 2017 as the first national picture of the health of and threats to Canada's fresh water. But really, we've been working on these since 2013. So we've got lots of interesting results to share. And so I'm really looking forward to presenting them to you today and just getting your questions. So to start off, I'll start with a little bit of a background. So just why we created these assessments, sort of our logic and our reasoning behind that. And I'll briefly share some national scale results. But then I'll focus more on the Great Lakes, since that's sort of the discussions we're having here today. So I'll focus on the health results, and then I'll do a deeper dive on the threat results of the Great Lakes. And then I'll talk about some next steps and what WWF Canada is doing as an organization to address the results of the health and the threats assessment. So I like to start off with this cool image of Canada. It's mapped by its lakes, rivers, and coastlines. And I think this really shows us that Canada is a water country. And in fact, we really are. We do have 20% of the world's fresh water within our borders. This number can be a little bit misleading. I mean, some of that, includes water locked in glaciers. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's water that's accessible, but we do have really this abundance of fresh water compared to a lot of other countries. 60% though of the water in Canada does flow north. And so that's something that we don't always realize, especially when 85% of us live along the southern border. So the water that we interact with every day, a lot of it does flow north. And water is consistently rated as the most important resource to Canadians. So according to the Royal Bank of Canada's 2016 Water Attitude Survey and different surveys that they did previous to that and since, water is always ranked the most important resource to Canadians, well above oil and gas or any other natural resource that we have. And so you might think that since we have all this water, that we consider it the most valuable resource and most important resource we have, that everything's doing fine. We know what's going on. We understand it. We protect it, but we know that that's just not the case. So at WWF, we had this vision with lots of different other environmental NGOs in Canada of seeing all waters in Canada in good ecological health by 2025. So it's a really nice statement. I'm sure a lot of people would support this statement. But when it came down to it, we started asking ourselves questions. So what does good ecological health mean? How do we know once we're there? What can we do to measure it? And so out of those questions came our watershed reports. So the watershed reports are a twinned assessment. So there are two assessments that make up the watershed reports. We have a health assessment and a threats assessment. And together, the idea was that they would show us the state of our waters and what are those stressors or those threats that are impacting what we see on the ground. So I'll give you a brief overview of how we calculate the health and the threats of our watersheds, starting with our health metrics. So our health assessment is broken down into 4 metrics that we see here on the screen. Our hydrology, fish, benthic macroinvertebrates, and water quality metrics. And so we came to these not at random. We had a scientific advisory committee that helped us really identify ways to quantify or to assess the health of watersheds in Canada. And it came down to these 4 metrics. So the idea behind them was that together they're quite representative of the state of fresh water. And the idea too was that they're pretty basic. So we should, in theory, be able to access data to confidently assess the state of these 4 metrics. As you'll see in the next slide, that didn't exactly happen. But the idea is that they're relatively basic, but they're also quite scientifically rigorous. So we really wanted to strike that balance between having metrics that people could understand and that there was data for, and having metrics that actually meant something. So for a hydrology metric or flow metric, we look at changes through time. So we'll look at annual trends and monthly trends. We look at long-term trends, so monitoring stations that have been online for 50, 70, 100 years, and shorter or more recent term trends. If there's a dam, we can do a pre versus post-dam analysis to try and understand really the impact of that particular barrier. If there are no dams, we can compare historic time periods to recent time periods. And the goal is just really to understand how the flow in a given watershed has changed over time. Fish is a bit of a tricky one, just because it seems that everybody in Canada monitors fish in different ways. And so there's no real standardized way of assessing fish, which makes it a little bit difficult to create an assessment metric. But we basically look at the decline of native fish species over time. So, did we start off with a certain number of fish and now have fewer fish on average? Is there an increase? Is it the same? And we go from there. For benthic macroinvertebrates, so these are the animals that are small. And they can tell us a lot about the health of our rivers. So a lot of them are quite sensitive to pollutants. They're sensitive to changes in temperature or dissolved oxygen within a body of water. So they're really good indicators to help us understand what's going on. And so for this particular metric, we use what's called the Hilsenhoff Biotic Index. And it's a standardized way of assessing things. It's quite commonly used. It's not something that we came up with. It already existed. So that was a really good fit for a particular assessment. And then finally, we look at water quality. So what we look for is basically what proportion of time or how many times do water quality measurements exceed the guidelines. So we look at guidelines for healthy aquatic life. So these guidelines come to us either from the federal government or the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, the CCME. Sometimes those guidelines come to us from the provincial or territorial governments. But we use those guidelines and we say, okay, for example, aluminum. Of all the measurements of aluminum that I have for my watershed, how many times does it go over those prescribed limits? And we go from there. So the data that we use for these 4 metrics come to us from a whole bunch of different sources. We don't actually go out and monitor the water ourselves. What we do is we try to gather data from all the different monitoring agencies, monitoring groups out there. So for example, the hydrology metric all of our data comes to us from Environment and Climate Change Canada's HIDAP program. It's really comprehensive. There's good data across the country. And so we really can just use the data that they have. For water quality, however, we can't just take Environment Canada data because it's just not enough. There's not enough of it for us to be confident in what it's saying. So we'll take some Environment Canada data, we'll take some provincial databases if they exist, we'll reach out to watershed groups and different communities and cities and see if they have data. And we put it all together and analyze it together as a whole. And one thing I wanted to add too was that we don't assume that the data that we have is enough for us to be able to attribute health scores. So while we do these analyses, we also do what we call a data sufficiency analysis. So that's just for us to make sure that the data that we have is representative of what's actually going on. So we want to make sure we have recent data, that we have enough spatial variation of the data within a watershed, not just a whole bunch of sites within a small corner of the watershed. And that, you know, it's not just a one-time measurement, that there's repeat measurements so we can understand that it's, if there are trends. So that's something that we consider as well. So here we see the overall health scores for the whole country. So the units that we see with the white outlines, those are the units that we use for assessment. So you can see those are still quite large regions. And so I do like to remind people that this is a national scale assessment. We use the same methodology across the country for these results. And while I think it tells a really interesting story, we don't replace the assessments that are done at a more local scale using, you know, indicators and metrics that can be very localized and very representative of that particular area. Those assessments are also great and also super valuable. We really feel like our assessment complements those smaller scale assessments. So what we see on this map is a whole lot of gray, which we were really disappointed in seeing. This indicates lots of data deficiency. And in some of these areas, it might be expected because, you know, it's quite remote. We know that it's just impossible to monitor every single watershed in the country. But some of those watersheds, if you look closely in the southern prairies, there's even some in the Great Lakes that have data deficiency, you know, in southern Quebec. These are areas that we feel like there should be some data and we just weren't able to either access it or the data doesn't exist. And where there was enough data for us to be able to attribute these health scores, it's often less than the good that we want to see. So we do see quite a bit of red and orange and yellow on this map, and that's worrying for us as well. I do want to say that these are results from our 2017 assessment, and that we are actually relaunching or we reassessed these the health of the different watersheds with updated data, and those results are actually going to be coming out in a few weeks. So these results now are a little bit outdated, but unfortunately I can't share with you their new results quite yet, but I do invite you to keep your ear to the ground and see that in a couple of weeks we'll be sort of relaunching this and have new results. So we also do a threat assessment. So, you know, the health assessment, the idea is for us to understand, okay, how are things now? How are things on the ground? What is the state of health of our watersheds? And the idea behind the threats assessment is to understand what are those drivers? What are we, you know, what should we be worried about? And so with the same sort of scientific advisory committee, we created this threat assessment with these 7 key threats. So for pollution, we look at things like point source pollution. So talk about like municipal runoff, that sort of stuff. We'll look at the risk of agricultural contamination, the risk of pipeline incidences. So those are all will all fall under the pollution threat. Habitat loss, we look at the conversion of natural landscapes to artificial landscapes or surfaces. Over allocation of water or water use, it's pretty straightforward. It's just a ratio of how much water is there available versus how much water do we use. Habitat fragmentation looks at the fragmentation of those streams by things like dams and road and rail crossings. Alteration to flows looks at the sizes of large dams and the sizes of the reservoirs behind those dams so that they really change the flow and how rivers operate and evolve. Invasive species is obviously the presence of invasive species. And climate change, we look at climate change to date. So we don't use any sort of forecasting models. That would sort of be a little bit too complicated. But we look at the changes in precipitation patterns and temperature patterns to date. So when we look at our threat results, what stands out to me is first is really that north-south gradient. So we really see those higher threat scores in the southern latitudes, closer to the border with the states. We see the results, and it's sort of these are areas where we have a lot of agricultural activity. These are where our biggest cities are. This is where, you know, there's resource development. And so it sort of makes sense that we see those higher threats further south. But it doesn't mean that there are no threats further north. Some of the more northern watersheds are very impacted, we know, by climate change, and that is also something that we see in our assessment. Some of the largest dams in the world are found in those northern watersheds, for example, in northern Quebec. And so those, the moderate scores that we see are really driven by those very, very large dams. And so it tells us a lot, but also I think this overall threat scores allows us the opportunity to dive a little deeper, and I'll show you what I mean just after in a few slides. So I will now move over to results for the Great Lakes watershed. So we can do a deep dive into all of these different watersheds. Can't do that today. So I will dive into the Great Lakes. I'll show you what the results look like when we dive into those different indicators. And then I'll also show you our website and where you can take your time and go through those results and use the website. So the overall health for the Great Lakes Basin, which is what we see here, the overall it's data deficient. So on the left, we see the overall health being data deficient, and then those 4 health indicators. So flow, water quality, fish, and benthic invertebrates. For us to be able to attribute an overall health score, we need at least 3 of those 4 indicators to have a score. And as we can see, fish and benthic invertebrates are data deficient at the basin or the whole Great Lakes scale. But what we see on the map is that we can actually zoom in a little bit more and look at those sub-watersheds. So those are the 02A, 02B that we see. So those are all the individual sub-watersheds that make up the Great Lakes Basin. So when we look at this scale, we can see that actually 3 of them do have an overall health score, so ranging from good to fair. And we can actually dive into those results a little bit more, just because we do want to see sort of, you know, it might be interesting for us to see what exactly is driving those scores. So if we look at just hydrology, we can see that all of the sub-watersheds have a score. And that's what we really like to see. And that's no surprise. I mentioned the HYDAT monitoring program from Environment and Climate Change Canada. They have really good data availability for all of these basins. And so the scores vary from good to fair again. And we think, you know, they're pretty representative of what we know to be true. If we move on to water quality, we can see that the 02A, so the northwestern part of Lake Superior, is data deficient, but that the other sub-watersheds were able to get a score. And again, we see the range of scores between good and fair. If we move over to our threat scores, this is where I think the picture is a lot more dire, or, you know, it packs a bigger punch. Overall, the threat scores for the Great Lakes are rated as very high. And that's driven by very high threat scores from pollution, habitat fragmentation, overuse of water, and invasive species, as we see on the left. If we look at those individual sub-watersheds, we can see that their overall threat scores vary from high to very high. So even what we think might be more remote areas, like along Lake Superior, they're still hit with very high threat scores or high threat scores. But if we wanted to, so this is a composite of those 7 indicators that I have mentioned, but we can dive a little bit deeper and see what those different indicators score. So pollution is very high, like I mentioned, at the overall scale, and it's very high in all but one of these sub-watersheds. And the high pollution scores are really driven by point source pollution. So like I mentioned, that could be things like sewer runoff in municipalities and things like that. But also depending on the sub-watershed in question, this is more of a threat for the southern ones. The risk of agricultural contamination is really high. So this is where the risk of contamination from nitrogen and phosphorus is quite high and really drives that very high pollution score. Moving on to habitat loss. For the whole watershed, it's moderate. But when we dive into those individual sub-watersheds, then we see that there's a different story, right? So from the more northern ones, we see that the risk of habitat loss is quite low, relatively speaking. But when we move towards the more southern ones, that's where we see the moderate, high, very high threat scores. And so that's really because of the change in land use and land cover. So in those areas, as we know, we really went from these natural landscapes to artificial ones. So either through urban expansion or agricultural expansion, when we transform forests or grasslands for agricultural purposes or urban purposes, it really does impact our water. And so that's what we see here. Fragmentation is also very high, high and very high throughout the basin. And this is really driven by things like road density. So we know there's an extensive road network in much of this basin. So every time those roads crisscross streams and rivers, it creates a barrier. And even if there's a culvert and it's a pretty well-made culvert, it's still not the same as a natural stream, right? So it does absolutely impact our watersheds. Water use is very high throughout this basin. This is just, we look at the comparison between our ratio of water yield, so how much water is available, how much water falls, and the amount of water that we use. So it's very high throughout the basin. Invasive species, again, it depends on the sub-watershed. We see it as a very high threat in the more southern basins, but still a high threat in the more northern ones. And I think that speaks to the connectivity of the Great Lakes Basin as a whole. We know there's extensive shipping going on and a lot of recreation activities that we know can influence the presence of invasive species. And climate change overall is moderate for the basin. And this is in comparison to those more northern basins that I talked about a few slides earlier, that those are the ones where we're seeing the impacts of climate change more than these southern ones. So comparatively, climate change isn't as big a threat right now for these southern basins compared to the ones in the Yukon and NWT and Nunavut. And finally, alteration of flows. So here we, as a reminder, we look at the large dams and the reservoirs behind them. So it really depends. I mean, there are some basins or sub-watersheds where they don't have those very large dams and those very large reservoirs. And so the threat isn't as considerable as some of the sub-watersheds where we know there are very large dams, often used for hydroelectric generation. So now I will try and go to our website. And hopefully this works, I think. Yeah, you can still see that. I won't spend too much time here, but what I do want to share is, and invite you to check it out yourselves. It's quite an interactive website. We're really proud of it. So what you can see is, so for example, I've got the Great Lakes threat results pulled up here. So there's a description of the results themselves. If I'm interested in a particular sub-watershed, so for example, the Lake Ontario one, I can click, it zooms in, and then it's a breakdown of the threat scores for this particular sub-watershed. I can also look at its health scores. So it tells me a little bit about what's going on here. And for the health scores, now I'm looking at overall health, but for example, if I specifically wanted water quality, I could look at that. And I could actually look at the different the sites that we've used to calculate that score. So if I wanted to zoom in even more, could see that this particular site was very good, whereas maybe one down here, just in Toronto, this one scored poor. So I could see the results like that. So I do invite you to check that out when you have a second. And so here's the website, watershedreports.wwf.ca. If you just Google Watershed Reports, it should come up as well. So that was a whirlwind look into the Watershed Reports. If you're like me, if you like data, you can probably spend a whole lot of time diving into our analyses, and I absolutely invite you to do that. But we also have a report. It sort of distills the results. And out of this assessment, we came some recommendations. So we felt like, we've been working in this world for quite a while as an organization. We've definitely learned some things, and we definitely have some recommendations on how to improve freshwater management, how to improve freshwater monitoring, and just generally how, as a freshwater community, how we can work together. And so some of the main recommendations that came out were around the lack of support for community-based monitoring. We worked, through our outreach to access all of these data sources, we were in contact with amazing groups from across the country doing really great work, but oftentimes that work doesn't necessarily lead to the impact that they think that their work could have. So sometimes they're monitoring and they're doing great, but the data stays on a spreadsheet on somebody's laptop. Or maybe they've got a really great group of people who are excited to do something, but they don't have the resources to get equipment, or they don't know how to go out and monitor. And we think that's a real lack of, it's an opportunity missed, especially considering the data deficiency that we see. We also had a lot of recommendations around how things need to be more consistent. So the protocols for monitoring, the protocols for analysis, these all need to be consistent nationwide, so that assessments like these, like the watershed reports, are easier and can be more effective, can be more done more easily. And so quickly, just as I wrap up, some of the next steps. So I did mention that we've got a reassessment coming in just a few weeks, so stay tuned. So we've reassessed the health scores that we see, and there are some changes in scores. And so stay tuned for that. And WWF does act on the recommendations that I mentioned in the previous slide. So I mentioned issues with the lack of support for community-based monitoring, and that's where a project like STREAM comes in. So STREAM stands for Sequencing the Rivers for Environmental Assessment and Monitoring. And basically what it does is we work with community groups and First Nations organizations and really whoever's interested across the country, and we provide them with the resources that they need to go out and monitor their home waters. So if a group is really interested, but maybe they just need some equipment, well, we can work with them and either provide them with equipment, or we can help them write funding proposals if that's something that they might not have the capacity to do, so that they can have the equipment that they need. we can go out and do training. So to make sure that they know what they're doing when they're going out there and that they're collecting data in a way that's useful for assessments and useful for us to understand the state of freshwater health in Canada. We also have a project called In the Zone. So the zone is the Carolinian Zone. So this is a partnership with Carolinian Canada, and this Carolinian Zone being Southern Ontario. And the Carolinian Zone is really a hot spot for biodiversity. So a third of the at-risk plants and animals in Canada are in the Carolinian Zone, but also a quarter of Canadians live in this particular area. So there's a lot that can be done by Canadians to mitigate the impacts that they might have on the environment. So we provide gardeners, for example, the tools to transform their backyards into refugia, or to help the species that might need it the most to sort of bounce back. And finally, last example of what we do is our less salty program. So part of what came out of the Watershed Reports was, recognizing that one of the major drivers of water quality, especially in large urban areas, is the application of road salt in the winter. Some of the streams in and around Toronto, right now this program is focused in Toronto, but it's going to expand. But some of the streams in and out of Toronto, after if there's been a lot of road salt application because of a freezing rain event or something, some of those streams have the salinity compared to oceans. And so we know that the species that live there, should be living there, can't support that. And so we work with property owners, campuses, and different partners to reduce the amount of road salt used, but to also trial different options, so that we're not just putting salt there. There's brine out there. We've heard of the beet juice, things like that. So we're trialing it in different areas just to see what works. So with that, I will wrap up. I'm happy to go through any of the questions that I see have come up in the chat box. And if I don't get to them all, feel free to reach out. Or if some of them come a little later on, again, feel free to reach out. Okay, so there are a lot. So does citizen science play a role in data collection? Absolutely. I touched on it a bit, but some of the data that we use for health assessment comes to us from citizen science groups, from watershed organizations. It depends on what's being collected and how it's being collected, but there are great examples across the country of watershed groups contributing data to our assessments. So for example, out east, there's the Atlantic Water Network. They're based out of St. Mary's University, but they really coordinate a lot of the community-based monitoring throughout the Maritimes. And they've now joined with the Gordon Foundation, who we will hear from later on today, to have this stuff called the Atlantic Data Stream, and it's this amazing repository of data, a lot of it being data collected by citizen scientists. And so that's absolutely one of the sources of data. And then a question about major lack of data in Midwestern Ontario where the Bruce Power is located. That's a really good question, and I don't know. We do know, when I talk about data deficiency, some of it is just that the data doesn't exist, but we do know that there are areas where data does exist and we just weren't able to access it. Sometimes it's just we don't know the right person to email and say, hey, this is what we're doing, can you share? Sometimes there are people who don't want to share data. Sometimes, yeah, it's tricky. So when we do assess the health of a given area, what we start off with is those large databases, so the federal government, the provincial governments, and then we'll start our outreach into other data providers. But it's not always easy. Not everybody wants to share their data, so it's definitely a challenge. I can't speak to whether or not they're censoring. I don't know specifically about that, but it is, it's a challenge that we've seen throughout the country, just areas where we know there should be more data, but we just don't have access to it. And so one of the recommendations that does come out of our report is that data that is being generated for things like environmental impact assessments, we think those should be open to the public, not just living in those PDF files, you know, on a proponent's computer, for example. But ideally, you know, that's the ideal, but we're not there yet. Why are the greatest concentrations of very poor subwatersheds located in northern Manitoba, central Saskatchewan, and Alberta? So is this due to agricultural effluent discharges and some damming? So yes. So I can go into the reports, but yeah, in those particular jurisdictions, the major threats, especially in the southern parts of the prairie provinces, are pollution from agricultural contamination. Moving further north, there's a lot of threat from pipelines. So that's a threat, one of the sub-threats from the pollution threat. And then things like habitat loss, so the conversion of natural landscapes to artificial surfaces. So, you know, converting a natural grassland, excuse me, to an agricultural field, that is also going to, you know, can lead to higher threat scores for habitat loss. Yeah, there's a lot of threats. Often where we see a lot of agriculture, we'll also see a higher threat of overuse of water just because of irrigation. And then I think you mentioned northern Manitoba. Yeah, so habitat fragmentation is an issue there as well. So we can, yeah, dams are definitely an impact, as with roads and rail crossings. So, and yeah, so there's lots of different threats, unfortunately. Is the World Wildlife Fund the only source of sub-watershed data collection? No, so we don't actually go out and collect any of the data ourselves. We'll work with partners, we'll get data from open databases and sort of bring them all together to generate these scores. And then do federal, provincial, and territorial governments recognize this data? Yeah. I haven't heard from the provinces themselves, but we do know that Environment and Climate Change Canada has used our assessments in some of the work that they've done. So for example, they've undertaken an assessment where they've used the Ottawa River as one of their focus areas now, or priority areas. And we do know that they've sort of pointed to the Watershed Reports as one of the assessments of the state of the health of the Ottawa River and its watershed. We do know a lot of watershed groups are use this with funding applications. So if you're a watershed group and you live in an area where there's data deficiency, you can use it, you know, to point and say, look, we need more resources for monitoring, or we need more resources for remediation, or whatever, you know, it might be in your particular area. So we do know that people use this quite a bit throughout the country. And the website address again, yeah, I can add that in. In relationship with conservation authorities and their role in protecting the watershed. So we have received data from conservation authorities. So obviously it's Ontario focused, but throughout the assessments, we do use the data from from conservation authorities when it's provided. And yeah, do you have any input in their evaluation of development and aggregate extraction impacts? No. You know, while we, you know, are happy to gather data, we don't have a particularly close relationship with conservation authorities. I think that's, you know, a lot of it is due just to the scale at which we work. WWF Canada and the Watershed Reports are a national scale assessment, and we're a national organization. So while we do focus in certain areas, we can't dive deep into, all the areas that we might want to, especially when there are other groups doing amazing work. We don't need to be duplicating efforts. And then what sort of oversight is used to ensure that collected data is accurate? That's a great question. And it's absolutely tricky. So it really depends. When data comes to us, or when we access data from large databases from the federal government, from provincial governments, territorial governments, QA/QC, so some sort of oversight has already happened, and so we're confident in using the data there. Often those databases also come, or those they come with sort of flags within the database itself, where it's just saying, like, this result is a little weird, maybe consider using it or not using it. But when we work with community groups, and when we're deciding whether or not we can include their data, it's tricky, because we want to include everybody's data, but unfortunately we still want, because we want our assessments to be scientifically rigorous, we do need to make sure that they're collecting water in a way that is scientifically rigorous, and that works well with the other data sets that we have. So a lot of times it's just having conversations. So for example, with the watershed group, how did they collect the data? What tools are they using? Do they take a graph sample and send it to a lab? If that's the case, that's often we're happy to use that data. So it really depends, but it's really about having those conversations. And same thing with benthic invertebrates. We were big proponents of the CABIN program, so that's Environment and Climate Change Canada's CABIN, the Canadian Aquatic Biomonitoring Network, which provides a standardized protocol that can be used nationwide to assess benthic inverts. And any data collected through that, or any samples collected through that, go to taxonomists. I do know that there are programs out there where they do stream side identification, and that's really tricky. It's hard to accept that data, just because we do know that stream side ID is really tricky. Even taxonomists with years of experience and access to very powerful microscopes, have issues identifying some individuals down to family. So I don't know that doing a stream side identification is always, it meshes well with data that we get from the CABIN database, for example. So really, it's about having those conversations and being honest about what data we can and can't accept. So I do see that we're sort of running a little bit low on time, and I think people probably want to break before the next sessions. But another question. So any suggestion for dealing with urban expansion in watershed areas, or is this under another jurisdiction? It's a tricky one. It's not something that we at WWF work on specifically, just because there are a lot of people already working on it. There are amazing watershed groups across the country, in major, who sort of fight that battle, and want to hold their city councils to respecting sort of urban sprawl and limiting urban sprawl. And so it's not something that we've necessarily worked on specifically. So unfortunately, I can't really offer any suggestions there, other than the data on the Watershed Reports does, some of those threats do speak specifically to some urban issues. So when you look at like pollution and point source pollution, there's a link definitely with urban areas. If you look at fragmentation, and where we have higher densities of roads, is often where we see, is often in cities, and we that can lead to higher threat scores. So I think the watershed reports can be a really great tool to support or to back any sort of discussion on limiting urban expansion. But WWF as an organization, we don't, it's not really one of the areas that we work in. Before I forget, I will share our website. So I'll just go through, make sure I answered everybody's questions and give you the last chance to ask them. And as I said, you know, if something else pops up in your mind when you're sleeping tonight or something, and you've got another question, please feel free to reach out. I'll share my email address here. So if something, you know, if you've got a question or, yeah, if something pops up, don't hesitate to reach out. All right, so I don't see any other questions. So I think, give you another minute, but I think we can probably wrap up. You're right. So thanks everybody for joining. And yeah, please reach out if you have any other questions or comments. I'm always happy to hear from the freshwater community. Thank you.